I was really eager to try this talk when Terry approached me about talking about something in honor of women's history, and it immediately popped to mind that I'd like to talk about many of the women who I've encountered as I've done research over the years. And so, of course, Mary Ingles is going to be one of them. As many of you know, I'm a descendant of Mary Ingles and did a lot of research on her. In fact, I've got a picture of the Ingles Tavern in here tonight, so be on your toes. You may spot it. And then there are a lot of other women that I have read about over the years as I've done research, and have noticed, of course, that the men are much more prominent. They get to be generals, and they get to be members of the House of Delegates, and they have a more prominent position. But some of the women have their stories that still survive. So that's what we're going to try to do tonight, and I hope I can move this along. So I'm going to talk about the women who were wives, but they were also mothers, and they were also daughters, and there's a lot of kinship that we'll invariably be mentioning tonight. But to begin with, I want to thank the historians who I particularly admire. When I was at the history graduate school here at Tech, I understood that I was supposed to learn how to do history in a very prescribed way, where you take what professional historians have written, you do further research and base your conclusions on their research, and you've got to do it a certain way. Well, I've always been a maverick, and I've always just wanted to dive into all of that history and make sense of it. And when I looked around at the faculty in the history department and said I wanted to do a biography of William Ingles, they looked at me like, are you crazy? That's not a master's thesis. You can't do that. So what I want to lift up tonight, in addition to the women who lived in the 18th century, are some of the women who've lived more recently, who have helped us gather information and make sense of it and write the stories that arise out of all their research. There are a lot of men out there doing history too. I don't mean to play favorites, but I think these women deserve a little bit of credit. Many of you may know Mary Kegley. She's written lots of these big, thick blue volumes with all the court records and all the births and all the marriage records, and it's a fabulous encyclopedia to which we can turn, any of us that are interested in Montgomery County or Giles County, all this region. She's written it up in her book. You can look up all the families. Another person that some of you may have met, she's been dead a good while now, but Lula Porterfield Givens also has a daughter that I'll mention, lived in Christiansburg and has written some histories of Christiansburg that I drew from. Another is her daughter, Patricia Givens Johnson, and she's written biographies of William Preston and Andrew Lewis, and they've been a big help to me. Then my first cousin, Roberta Ingalls Steele, died just a few years ago. She was not particularly an author, but she had the wisdom to make sure to publish a very important document, and that's this thing I mentioned here, the Escape from Indian Captivity, which was written by John Ingles in the 1830s. And he was the youngest son of Mary Ingles and William Ingles, and the manuscript is just charming, and it's a wonderful, it's almost a primary source. He tells us what his mother said and what his father said, and without Roberta's efforts it might be languishing in some archive. Then Claire White. Anybody here knew Claire? She just died in the last few years, and she was very involved with the Roanoke Historical Society, and I knew her at St. John's Church, and she did a history of St. John's, and then lo and behold, a few years ago, this biography of William Fleming came out, and he's a remarkable patriot and somebody really worth learning about, and so she did a very helpful task there by getting his story told. And then Nellie C. Preston, she's descended from Francis Preston, Smithfield family. Also happened to know of her through my father's family, because my great uncle was friends with her, lived down near 7 Mile Ford, and I have a book in which she inscribed a message to him. Well, she wrote a biography of Madame Russell, Elizabeth Henry Campbell Russell. I got it straight so far. She wrote a biography, actually, excuse me, it was not so much a biography as she imagined a journal. She wrote down a manuscript as if Elizabeth had written to her own daughter to explain her life. So, you know, the demarcation between fiction and nonfiction gets a little hard to distinguish, you know, and that's what I like to embrace, that everybody's effort to imagine and to tell a story has some value because you may be getting pretty close to the truth as you imagine. And if we had to stick to just the documents that we can actually say for sure, absolutely, we know who did what when, we wouldn't have much to say about the 18th century. So these are all people that I think we have a debt of gratitude for, and Women's History Month, let's celebrate these women. Oh, and then there's Elizabeth Lemon Sayers. I don't know much about her, but she wrote a book that's part of the two or three book series that they have down in Smith County about Smith County history. And so there was some very helpful information there about the Campbells and the Russells and some of those more southerly families. Here are some questions just to give you an idea of what motivates me, what has motivated me, what will probably continue to motivate me to want to find out more about my ancestors. We know that there was a trial, and I think William Preston was the head of the judge or whatever, the head of the committee that held this trial. And there were about 50 people in this area that were put on trial for being Tories, and most of them were found guilty. And they were fined with various amounts. One would be fined £100. Another one was told that their oldest son had to go serve in the Continental Army for a year. Well, in the case of William Ingles, it was never resolved. They could not find out for sure. Apparently someone had accused him of being a Tory and had put some kind of evidence up, but they couldn't prove it. So they couldn't finish. And so they made him pay a fine, sort of slapped his wrist. But the amount that they put is in several records, and it's just absolutely astounding. I want to get the History Channel here someday to help me do this research. But they fined him £100,000 in 1781, and he died in 1782. It was never resolved. So all we have is a little mention, you know, in a document that said that they asked him to pay that. We don't know if he had that kind of money. We don't know if he paid it. So that's really intriguing to me. What was the evidence that made somebody accuse him of being a Tory? Is it completely preposterous, or is there really some truth in it? And I still don't know, but that's a good motivator for doing the kind of research I do. As many of you may know, his wife, Mary, there's all sorts of books and plays, and most of the more recent versions of her story that have come out claim that she had a baby a few days after she was captured at Draper's Meadows. You all know the Mary Ingles story, right? You know that she walked back from Kentucky and all that. Well, the fact is, when she got back home and she had more children and she had grandchildren, many, many people swear that she never mentioned having a baby on the trail. She told her story, but never mentioned the baby. And so that's a wonderful dilemma. You know, when you try to reenact her story, how do you deal with that question that she never mentioned it? And yet so many other people think that that's part of her story. And so I've written some articles on that. It's come out in the Smithfield Review, and I still haven't resolved it, but it's always fun to see if there's any evidence. Sometimes you meet Shawnee descendants who swear that she lived in, you know, Chillicothe for years and had babies, or that they're descended. I'm going, where did they get that? How, you know, but it's a motivator. Another question that has particularly seemed important for this paper is to think about these women who were widowed fairly young, as Susanna was, and also Mary Ingles. Their husbands died within about a year of each other, and they were both born in 1729, so the husbands were in their 50s and these women were in their late 40s. So why did they not remarry? And I know from giving tours at Smithfield that we have a lot of theories about things that might have encouraged her to stay a widow, to give up not to give up her dower rights, or not to have her children lose their property. There may have been a lot of reasons, but that's a question, and I don't know about Mary Ingles. How well was Mary Ingles treated after she returned from captivity? There are a lot of stories out there that you run into that would indicate that people were really kind of prejudiced against or wary of those individuals that had lived among the Indians. There's a term Peter Wallenstein uses sometimes called white Indians, the people that lived for a long time as captives, and then they've acquired that culture, and so they don't really belong in either culture. And there's also a stigma that could be on women if they might have been raped or abused during captivity. People being who they are, they might not want to. And we know that Mary, when she got back and was at death's door and Adam Harmon was nursing her back to health, she told Adam about the German woman, or the Dutch woman, I think it was a German woman, who was still out there in the wilderness. And she told him a little bit about how this woman had gone crazy and tried to attack her. And Harmon's reaction was, "Oh, that's awful. I'll never go help her. No, she's an awful woman." So Mary found out right away that it's not safe to tell people about an ordeal that you've experienced. So I thought that was kind of an interesting thing. So I'm wondering, did Mary have a long life of living in a community where they kind of regarded her as a freak, as something they couldn't relate to? Any of you know how to walk 800 miles in 45 days? I mean, she was extraordinary in that way and may have been tainted. Another would be a question of what difference you can see among these women, because the ones that had education and the ones that didn't, what difference did it make? Another is Elizabeth Gibbons, and Lewis is my great-grandmother too, because she had a granddaughter that married one of Mary's grandsons, a McClanahan. And so my family, tree has the connection back to Andrew Lewis and his wife Elizabeth. And I've always been intrigued that I don't know much about Elizabeth, and I haven't really been all that curious. But one of the reasons I haven't pursued it is there's hardly a word written about her. Although there's a little bit now with the attempt that was made in his biography, but not a lot. And so now this has been a very difficult topic to stay organized and to have some structure. So I picked a list of men that you might already know about. You know about General Andrew Lewis and Colonel Preston, and you can see their dates there, so you can get some idea comparatively of who was older than whom. Colonel William Ingles, Colonel William Christian, who's about 15 years, well, something like that, 14, 15 years younger. General William Campbell and General William Russell. Does anybody know who was married to both of those generals? That was Elizabeth Henry. Got to be married to two generals. That was her claim to fame. And then William Fleming. I didn't get a chance to look up carefully and figure out what rank he attained, but he did fight. He was also a doctor. And the William Fleming High School in Roanoke is named after him. And then Governor Patrick Henry. I didn't put him on my original list of people, but man, you can't get away from references to Patrick Henry or his sisters or things that he was involved in. And his speeches, in fact, I've heard that Elizabeth Henry Campbell, when she first arrived in Aspen Vale down, in Smith County, Smith County today, everybody wanted to meet her. They were eager to meet her because she was a sister of Patrick Henry. So he was very well known, and she had a certain aura about her because of her connection. And then George Rogers Clark and William Clark. They got on this list, they're sort of the last ones to add, is because I've read several novels by James Alexander Thom, and one of them is all about the Clark family. And Anne Rogers, she's portrayed in those books as someone with such wisdom and common sense and such a good mother. And look what two of her sons did. You all know, I assume, about George Rogers and capturing Fort Vincennes and all that he did. And then, of course, William Clark was part of the Lewis and Clark expedition. So here are the brides that come into play. I apologize for a few missing dates. It was just very hard in the last few weeks to stop and carefully find everything. Susanna Smith, you all know pretty well. Mary Draper. Notice that Susanna would have been 8 years younger than Mary. Elizabeth would have been 4 years older than Mary. Anne Henry, I believe there's a letter that talks about the frolic that they had at the wedding. Just these little tidbits of references to things that really catch your attention. William Christian, of course, is who Christiansburg was later named after. And here we get to the Henry sisters. Elizabeth, who married William Campbell first, and then when he died, married William Russell. And then William Christian's sister, Anne, married William Fleming. Don't quite have that date. It's in one of the books, but I didn't find it. And then Sarah Shelton was the first wife of Patrick Henry, and pay attention to the children as we get to them. It's pretty impressive. The next wife was Dorothea Dandridge. Really very impressive credentials in Tidewater gentry, very well educated and capable woman. And then Anne Rogers, who married John Clark. And then we're on to portraits. Portraits are always an interesting topic to me. During the 19th century and on into the 20th century, there are lots of occasions that I've discovered where people were so eager to have a portrait of their ancestor that they kind of, indulged in some wishful thinking and found something in the attic and said, see, this is it, this is our ancestor. And there have been a lot of occasions like that. But for real, this is one of the portraits of one of these women, and you've all seen it, I imagine, at Smithfield, a really pretty portrait of Susanna Smith. Motherhood. Here we go. These facts are just kind of interesting, I think. Elizabeth Lewis had at least 7 children. Susanna had 10. Mary had 6, possibly 7. It's interesting, we know so much about Mary, but we'll never resolve whether she had that baby or not. I don't think there's going to be any way to really put it to rest. And Anne Christian had 6. And Elizabeth Campbell had 2 by William Campbell, and then 4 more by William Russell. Anne Fleming had 13. And I'll show you a quote later on that refers to the 6 or 7 children that died. William Fleming was looking back from, as an old man, just mentioning in passing the 6 or 7 children that died. It's just sad. Sarah Henry had 6 children. That was Patrick Henry's first wife. Dorothea had 11 more. That makes 17. And by the time the 17th one was born, there were grandchildren in the household. So Patrick Henry had his hands full. And Dorothea probably deserves a lot of credit for taking on this big household of Sarah's children and adding to it in such a prolific manner. And then Anne Clark, she only had 10, but her second oldest was George Rogers. And in the book, From Sea to Shining Sea by James Alexander Thom, I just love the way he brings to life little Georgie, who is 18 years younger than his big, brave, strapping, soldierly older brother, George. So little Billy is looking up to George, his big brother, and strutting around and copying him. And that's so convincing to me that there was that kind of rapport within the family. Okay, here we get to that picture I referred to talk about Mary. This is as good a picture as any. Of course, this tavern was built in 1772. There was already a ferry across the river. William Ingles had gotten a license for the ferry 10 years earlier. This side of the river, which is the Pulaski side of the river, I'm really fond of because my mother's aunts were all raised at the ferry on that side of the river in a beautiful old Victorian house. And they'd come down and play in the fort and sometimes spend the night, camping out kind of things in the fort. And I remember being in Erie, Pennsylvania in 1956, and my father was looking for a house down in Charlotte, and Mother sat us down by the fireplace and told us, some of these stories about Mary. And that's probably when I really began to catch the bug. It's so exciting to try to imagine what was life like back then. But Mary had her fair share of trials and sorrows. You know about the attack at Draper's Meadows. You know about, I think most of you do, the sad fact that if she had that baby on the trail, and if the baby survived, which is the version that I think is most compelling, she must have come to a place in her life where she said, okay, if I stay here, I'm going to have trouble fighting off the advances of this French trader, or I'm going to have, you don't know exactly what it was, but I think she could see that if she stayed, this is what might happen. And then the other alternative was to do the impossible and try to walk home. And what I think is particularly impressive about Mary is her unwillingness to be a victim. She made a decision that nobody else would have even perceived to be an option. She made a choice, and it worked out for her. But what a grief she must have carried for the rest of her life, something that would have been unspeakable. To say, can you imagine sitting around the fire telling your children and grandchildren your story and saying, yeah, well, you had a really sweet little sister named Eleanor, and I decided to leave her behind. No problem. She probably turned out all right. I mean, how can you tell your children that? How can you tell your best friend? Then what you may not have heard, some people were surprised when I mentioned this lately. In 1779, Mary's son Thomas, who had been raised as a Shawnee until he was 17, and then had chosen to come back to Virginia. He studied in Albemarle, may have met Thomas Jefferson, studied with Thomas Walker, fought at the Battle of Pleasant, what is that thing? Mount Pleasant.
Point Pleasant.
Point Pleasant, thank you. Mount didn't sound right. And married Eleanor Grills from Albemarle. So here's this white Indian who Mary and William must have really, had a lot of anxiety about over the years because he never particularly seemed happy in Virginia society. He was always a little bit of an outsider. So he and his wife were living in Burke's Garden in 1791. They had 3 children, William, Mary, and Rhoda, and they got attacked by Shawnee. He would have known these braves, and he knew how to track them, so he had a posse that followed them. One part was supposed to go around in a pincer move and attack, and they got lost. So at dawn, Thomas had to go ahead and attack. His wife got struck by a tomahawk. She survived and lived to have more children later on. Rhoda, who she was holding, survived. No harm was done to her. But William and Mary were mortally wounded that day and died within the next day or two. And what a story for someone to have gone through the Indian attack herself, to have come all the way back home, and what is that, 40 years later, to have her grandchildren die in Indian attack, just a little further west. Burke's Garden can't be but, what do you think, 60 miles west here, southwest? And then another real tragedy for Mary was that her husband was accused of being a Tory, and I don't know what happened to Tories in Southwest Virginia after the war. I don't think there's been enough written about it. We know in some communities on the coast that Tories might have gone down to the islands to live. In other communities, they may have gone to Canada and just left, the United States. But I'm sure that Mary didn't leave. She stayed here. But I don't know what her experience of that was. I don't know if every penny had been given to the government because of his being accused of being a Tory. We just don't know. Okay, let's go on. Elizabeth Henry Campbell Russell had some difficulties too, and one of the things that jumped out at me in rereading some of this is the conflict that developed between her first husband and her second husband. Her daughter, who later married Francis Preston, was very, very unhappy to have another man come around courting her mom. And there was political things that may have colored it as well. But that unhappiness finally took shape in that Arthur Campbell, who was a cousin of William Campbell, the father, decided that Elizabeth wasn't doing the right thing. So he took this girl and put her in school with his daughters, and she was estranged from Elizabeth for years. And it wasn't until after William Russell had died before there was that reconciliation. So that's a sad thing to carry around. So then Elizabeth Gibbons Lewis, the thing that I can say about her, which is not much, is that we know that Andrew Lewis was fighting all the time. He no sooner got back from the Sandy Creek expedition that he was sent down to build a fort for the Cherokee, and no sooner was that over that he was sent to some powwow to resolve something. If you just read where he was, you got to figure out. And this was during a very difficult time with a lot of danger of living even in the Stanton area where they were. So I think that's her story of doing all that she did on her own, and it's not too surprising that her life remains hidden from view. Another interesting thing, though, about Andrew, his mother, Margaret Lynn Lewis, there's a lot of information about her, but in 1860 or so, a writer whose name I couldn't pull up from my memory bank or from any of the books on my shelf, but there was a fiction writer that wrote a journal, fictionalized, just made it out whole cloth, put a journal in a newspaper and published it during the Civil War. And it became very popular, and it was Margaret Lynn Lewis' Commonplace book. And it was just great. It was a good read. It was wonderful. And it was purportedly the original journal that Margaret Lynn Lewis had written. Well, soon a lot of historians began to find mistakes in it. It mentioned her talking to her husband a few years after her husband died. Just a few little problems like that. But what's funny is, once it got published, it must be true. So there's evidence that the DAR found it sometime in the 1920s and published it. Because it's wonderful. Look at all this great stuff. And then guess what? The historians found out that no, you shouldn't have published it because it's not true. And it just keeps perpetuating. So there's that wish to know. But to give respect to Nellie C. Preston, she didn't pretend that this was, when she wrote a journal for Elizabeth Campbell Russell, that it was the original. She just wanted to exercise her right to write fiction. So I think that's kind of funny. But we really want to know about these women, don't you think? So here's some more sorrows and trials. Sarah Shelton Henry is one of the most tragic figures that I looked at. Does anybody know what happened to her? Well, I've already got it here on the screen, sorry. She really, really did go off the deep end and was just out of control, mental health. And they ended up putting her in a basement room, and they must have had to tie her to the chair. They had several servants that stayed with her. But it's very sad. And I saw one comment that said, those of you that know all about the Henrys, you can correct me if I'm wrong on any of this, but one comment that said that she couldn't handle, I believe it was the move to Scotchtown, which is where they had recently moved, which was a bigger plantation. It was a very elegant place. It had a lot more slaves. She had to be the mistress of a much bigger operation than she'd ever had before, and she couldn't handle it. It was just partly the stress of that. Plus, she had, 6 children. And then Anne Henry Christian, her story has always seemed very sad to me. I've been interested in the Christians because they had property at Mahanaim, or whatever it's pronounced, Dunkard's Bottom, right next to where the Ingles had their ferry and tavern. So I followed them, but William Christian went to Kentucky with his family. He even took his mother out, and she gave up and came home. She was smart. but he took his family out and was determined to make a go of it because he was such a good Indian fighter. But he did get killed in a battle. There's even some reference to the possibility he may have been tortured. That might have been true, might not have been true, we'll never know. But Anne said before they went that she didn't want to go to Kentucky. And her husband died 4 months after she got there. And she died within 4 years of that, of TB. So you think of this young, relatively young woman out in a very, very desperate situation with no security, and her husband, the big hero, having been killed. That's not the life I wanted to lead. Then Susanna Smith, it's been a while since I've done a tour at Smithfield, but I think we've referred in the past to the letters that we have that were written after William Preston's death. And there's some indication in those letters that she might have been a little bit isolated there at Smithfield. There were times when she also went to Whitethorn and other plantations where her children lived. There was property that her husband had acquired. But, you know, when her children weren't there visiting, or her grandchildren, I imagine it was a little bit lonely to have a big plantation and all the slaves, and yet, you know, a lot of your family wasn't there. Anne Rogers Clark, she too had to move to Kentucky rather late after all their sons and daughters were pretty big. She also had the fascinating story of, to hear James Alexander Tom tell it, of having John, her oldest, be a prisoner, I think, on a boat out of New York, a British boat, and then another son was fighting, I think, in South Carolina, and George was on his way into the Northwest. And, you know, one family sending their sons in so many directions during that revolutionary period. It's a good illustration of the choices that people had as to where they'd sign up or where they might end up, but it really gets your attention. Okay, sorry, these maps did not copy at all well, and I'll do better next year when I get another invitation, if I ever do, sorry. But that's just a map that shows the Virginia and Kentucky expanse, and I believe only Anne Christian and Mary Ingles and Anne Rogers got that far. A lot of the men got that far, but most of the women didn't. And of course, Mary did it 20 years ahead of everybody else. Some people like to say that William Ingles and Mary Draper were the first white marriage west of the Alleghenies, and many people scoff at that. That's probably not true. There was plenty of German families around, and they were white. You know, so you have to wonder about that. But as far as a woman being on her own in Kentucky, Mary was a little bit unique. But don't forget the German woman. By the way, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that the Ingles family said over the years that the German woman was from Pennsylvania. We never knew her before. We never saw her again. She went back to Pennsylvania. A lot of the German families around the New River area say the German woman was Mrs. Bingaman. And there's Pepper's Ferry is where the Bingamans had property, and there was a Mrs. Bingaman who was captured. And, you know, you wonder, how come the family history didn't record it that way? Lure of the land in Kentucky. Andrew Lewis, I'm sure I'm missing some details, but I know that he settled and acquired a lot of land in what is now West Virginia, and of course there's a Lewisburg, West Virginia. He was very involved with the Greenbrier, and I believe in Ohio. There are a lot of land companies, and I can't get into that tonight. That's another subject for someone who studied it more closely. William Ingles had property in many places on the Clinch, on the New River, several pockets. Still had land here in Blacksburg until just before William Preston acquired it. Then he had land at Burke's Garden, and that's why his son was down there and got attacked later on. William Preston, I just put down everywhere. Don't you think? He had a lot of property that he'd acquired, and his children all did very well, thank you very much. They all had nice estates to move to. William Christian, he was at Dunkard's Bottom, the place called Mahanaim. It's now under Clater Lake. And Dunkard's Bottom is where there was a Fort Frederick, which is where Mary came after she first got back from captivity, and Adam Harmon brought her someplace that was relatively safe, and that was where the Dunkards had been, which is one of those sects, German sects, kind of an unusual group of people that lived there. And by the time William Christian acquired it, there were just some old buildings, and he built a nice new frame house. But it's under Crater Lake. William Fleming did go to Kentucky, really hoped to acquire land himself in Kentucky. I believe he did acquire some, but his main job was to try to settle all the land disputes, all the legal documents, and it was a very difficult job that he undertook. But he was both a lawyer, well, he seemed to have the skills of a lawyer, and was certainly a physician. Arthur Campbell was involved with the state of Franklin. He's not one of the husbands that we're mentioning here, but he was a significant player in all of this. And John Clark did get to Kentucky, probably mainly because of his son George. Come on out, it's fine. I've got everything ready for you. They went the route along the rivers, though. They went north up to like Pittsburgh and came down. They didn't come on the Wilderness Road. And Patrick Henry, I've read that he didn't go out of the state but about 2 times, and that was briefly. So don't believe he ever made it to Kentucky. But I've also read, and some of you may know, I'm not a scholar on Patrick Henry, but that he had probably more land than anybody at his death. He was not apparently a good businessman. He didn't have much money in the earlier stages, but later on he was so sought after as a lawyer that he did begin to bring in some money, and apparently he did a lot of financial dealings to acquire properties. But if I'm inaccurate, I'm sure someone will straighten me out later on. It's too bad this doesn't show up very well, but maybe those dots do. Isn't it interesting to see all the dots on that map? Those are houses that Patrick Henry acquired. So if you wonder whether people ever met Patrick Henry, you could say, well, everybody in those counties probably met him when he lived there for a year or two. And that would have been part of the stress on Sarah, a lot of moves. So a lot of these women had to endure that kind of stress. But you can probably, like I saw Leatherwood signs as I drove to Danville just the other day. And of course the 3 big houses I'll show here in a minute. So 18th century families on the move. We know that the Lewises were in the Stanton area, and then they found a home near Salem, Richfield. William Preston, everybody here probably knows that, but they were first up in Tinkling Springs, Augusta County near Stanton, and then Greenfield, and then Smithfield. And the Ingles started out and the Drapers were in Pennsylvania. And then they were on the North Fork. I believe they probably got married on the North Fork. And that's right here in Blacksburg, right near where I lived a few years ago. You know, Ellett, that heads out over to Ellett Valley. As you go down that steep road, that's where there was a mill. And he had a mill in 1850 or so, about the time he got married. And then in the next few years they moved over to Draper's Meadows, which wasn't that far, right, to go from the Daily Bread over to the duck pond. But that is the other side of the transcontinental divide. They had gotten over into the Mississippi watershed, and they had broken the treaty. You know, all those things are kind of interesting to think about. But just a few blocks, and you're going to get yourself scalped. And then William took Mary to Bedford. In Bedford County, there's a something like a wilderness fort sign still on, is it 250 that goes over, I forget these, or 360, one of those that goes between Roanoke and Lynchburg. And I've actually been able to find out the property that I believe she lived on, and it's right up against Peaks of Otter. And it's just really fun. And there's a family very prominent in Bedford, the Triggs. There was a Stephen Trigg and several others. And one of them married her daughter. And I think that she made friends with some of the prominent families in Bedford. I don't know how much William was in Bedford, because he was still out here building forts, growing corn, and doing what he could. Christians were at the Borden's track up near Roanoke. then the Mahanaim, and then Kentucky, and Anne definitely didn't want to go. So a premonition on her part. They used to say Mary had premonition, but I think she did too. William Campbell, I've only sent Aspen Vale. I haven't done my homework to find out all the things I should know about William Campbell, but it's down right off of 81 today. There's still things you can see in the field where Aspen Vale was and where the cemetery is where he was buried. The Fleming family finally settled at Belmont, which is pretty close to where William Fleming High School is today. And Patrick Henry had Studley and Scotchtown and Red Hill. And I just happened to get out a magazine. You remember the Virginia Cavalcade? It was such a nice series of history articles. I have a bunch of them that my mother had saved and I've saved. And I opened up one, and here was 3 of Patrick Henry's homes and nice pictures. So I thought that was pretty cool. Then the Clark family lived in King and Queen County and Carolina County, or Caroline, must be Caroline, Albemarle County, and also in Kentucky. That didn't show up well either, but that's a sampler that's in, I think, the Roanoke Museum, or maybe the Salem Museum, does anybody know, of Anne Christians before she got married. And I think the point is appropriate to make that women passed on the culture and the history more than their husbands. Their husbands were gone a lot. And they did it through storytelling, and many of them were educated themselves and would have taught their little ones. And they passed along skills, handcrafts. Any of you visit Smithfield or visit us in Patrick County, you'll see coverlets and woven things and hooked rugs and crocheted, and all those things were part of a woman's world, and they helped keep them alive. Then here's a really nice letter that I referred to earlier. William Fleming wrote as an old man to a cousin, maybe a niece, who was living in Scotland. I'll just read it. Well, I guess you can read it. I live in a pleasant situation 180 miles from Richmond. Think of describing where you live as being that distance from Richmond. Isn't that interesting? Near a big lick, and the capital was his capital for lick, not for big. I don't know, in Botetourt County. I've retired from all public business, his spelling, for several years. I am now old. My constitution broke, maimed by several wounds, and often attacked with violent pains in my limbs, brought on by colds and many years of severe duty in a military line. He was severely wounded at the Battle of Point Pleasant, and they didn't think he'd survive. I think all of his intestines, it was just awful. But he did survive and then went on to do years of service in Kentucky. I'm just able to walk a little after 2 months confinement to my bed and room. And here's an interesting story about his family. Your aunt, who would be Anne, is in pretty good health but tender. Isn't that an interesting word? My eldest son Leonard is married, has several children, and lives in the state of Kentucky. My eldest daughter Elizabeth was married last December to a clergyman by the name of Allen. My daughters, Dorothea, Anna, Priscilla, and sons, William and John, are with me. We have buried 6 or 7 children, to not even be sure of how many babies were lost. I can imagine he was gone when a couple of those babies were miscarried or were delivered. So that tells you a whole lot about the experience of that married couple in a nutshell. Patrick Henry's sphere of influence. One of the things that is indirect but I think is significant about the kind of research that I love to do, by doing this paper and finding out a little bit more about Patrick Henry and reading a few more letters and quotes and things, you begin to realize how very real a person Patrick Henry was and how real his influence was when he made speeches about give me liberty or give me death. These were people that really regarded him as a hero. He was not quite as gentrified in their minds as the people, in Tidewater, Virginia. He was more of the common man and the firebrand. And he was just a real hero, especially the further west you got in the territory. He was somebody they could really relate to, and they really did applaud when they saw his sister come to town. And there's a record that I I think it was, yeah, right after Mary Ingles arrived back home, there's evidence that a messenger went to Williamsburg and spent the night at Patrick Henry's house, and they wrote up an account that got sent to a British paper. So Mary's story is tangled up with evidence of, Patrick Henry heard about it on such and such a date, and that's how it got in that paper in England, which you might find that paper, but you might not ever know. So this kind of research is really fun for me. This is one of his houses in Red Hill, which is still a nice place to go and study him, or take your group and have a visit. I think people at the Reynolds Homestead went a few years ago and had a very nice visit. It's a nice excursion. And I just had to say, doesn't this look like Smithfield? It really reminds me in scale and shape. Even the gates here at the front are the same shape as the ones y'all have out there. So for a postscript, I just happened upon this in the same Cavalcade magazine. Frontier women may have had it hard, but the Tidewater gentry had some misfortunes too, even if it wasn't an Indian attack. So here in this little entry in the magazine, it's about Mary Bird. She said that she sold the famous 3,500 volume library of her father-in-law, William Bird II, to help pay the debts of her husband, William Bird III, who had committed suicide. So there's some tragedy in a life of someone that you would have thought might have been pampered and live a happy existence. The Birds are really interesting. Have any of you ever done any research on them? Really colorful, lots of interesting journals and things that you can find. So some concluding thoughts. I only think that Mary Ingles and Elizabeth Campbell Russell are really what you would call famous or well-known anywhere, particularly. But I think Mary Ingles is well-known everywhere. You run into people all sorts of places that know about her. And Elizabeth, I think, is mainly known as Madam Russell, because she had a lot of influence down in Smith County and at Saltville. And Mary, I think, was famous because of her ordeal, and that's pretty obvious, I think, how that may have developed. But Madam Russell, both because of being married to the two generals and to being the sister of Patrick Henry, and then for having started the Methodist Church down there, Bishop Asbury and all that. And then, except for a few court documents that list the weddings and wills and that kind of thing, the lives and most of the other women that I've looked at for this study were not particularly recorded in public records, but some of their stories have been reconstructed through the patient and painstaking efforts of some of their descendants and genealogists and some historians, such as those women historians that I mentioned at the outset. So I wanted to just pay tribute to all those women in the 18th century who packed up their possessions and moved to the backcountry, braving unknown dangers. And it occurs to me there's a thread here. Tonight I was telling people how difficult adjustment has been for me to go 65 miles east to Patrick County, because there's a lot of things that aren't there that could make me feel like home. There isn't a university. There isn't an Episcopal church in Patrick County. There's a lot of things that just aren't there. And so these women had that experience every time they moved. And then those who bore so many children, you got to assume that about half of the children we listed would have been born at a time when their husbands were at Sandy Creek Expedition or Battle of Point Pleasant or Kings Mountain or over there on the East Coast. A lot of fighting that was going on, and a lot of men that also went off to hold office in Williamsburg and were gone for long periods of time. And although I think a lot of families clumped together and moved together en masse, there were still a lot of times when there wasn't that nice network. Mary Ingles, for example, only had one brother, and her sister-in-law Betty got captured by the Indians, came back 6 years later, but it was a pretty small core group of relatives to depend on, and her mother got massacred, at the Draper's Meadow Massacre. These women who managed to provide for their children during long periods of separation from their spouses, and they had complete responsibility for child rearing, food preparation, education, animal husbandry, gardening, doctoring, and then I love this, even homeland security, right? We know that Mary had to learn how to drop the iron into the water to make the bullets to feed the gun while they're shooting off an Indian attack at Fort Hope, which was their little fort near Ingles Ferry. And we know that Susanna Smith Preston was worried about Indian attacks, was worried about Tory attacks, that kind of thing. And these women who found ways to be resourceful and independent in a world that afforded them fewer opportunities and less power than women enjoy today. And maybe that's an interesting debate we could have. In some ways, their lives were kind of wide open, just surviving. There's nobody saying, no, you can't do that. Maybe the women in Tidewater had more constraints on them about how they should act, what they should wear, and what their daughters should be trained to do. But it still was a different world, and they had different assumptions to deal with. And the women who contributed their share of passion and enthusiasm in the process of forming the new republic. And I always think about Mary, that what little we have to hold on to of descriptions of her or of her children's versions of her, she seemed to have still a lot of zest for living, seemed to have not been embittered by what she lived through, and what a tribute, the stories that survive are of her stepping on a snake and calmly saying, hand me the hoe. That's all right. She's just very comfortable doing all these things that she knew how to do, very unflappable, and I think had a good sense of humor. The most negative thing that I know said about Mary was by the general who had been defeated by George Rogers Clark, Henry Hamilton, the hair buyer, who was captured by George Rogers Clark and came back through the Ingles Ferry and stayed there a couple of nights, maybe because the Ingles were Tories, I don't know. But anyway, they came through and he was treated royally. The daughters served a wonderful feast, and he wrote in his journal how attractive Ingles Ferry was and how attractive the Ingles daughters are and how gracious they were and how Mary seemed melancholy as she told him about her ordeal. And so I'm thinking, darn it, now forever they're going to think Mary was melancholy. She could have had a bad hair day, But then again, how do you tell about your children being taken away and adopted into Indian families and finding out later that one died or another died? Or how do you tell about, your long walk home and nearly starving to death? And how do you tell that without a tear in your eye? So, it's just a fun way to try to understand our history. And I would like to hold up a model for all of you that like arts and crafts like I do. I think of this as a process of weaving. And it's not just for us women, but weaving these threads of the little bits and pieces of stories we have is a process that's really worth something. And I hope the academic historians will honor it more and more as the generations come and go, because these women historians that I mentioned have preserved the fabric of life from the 18th century, even if we don't know a whole lot more facts about each woman or each child. And that's it. So I hope you enjoyed it.